The heat of the Egyptian desert in July is a physical weight. It presses down on the sand, distorts the horizon into shimmering mirages, and turns the metal hull of a tank into a suffocating oven. In the high summer of 1942, that heat was matched only by the suffocating panic gripping the British Empire.
Erwin Rommel, the legendary Desert Fox, was on the loose. His Africa Corps had just shattered the British lines, captured the vital port of Tobruk in a stunning humiliation, and was now racing eastward. Alexandria was a few days' drive away. Cairo was packing its bags. In the streets of the Egyptian capital, British diplomats were burning secret documents in such vast quantities that the day became known as Ash Wednesday. The sky over the embassy rained black flakes of charred paper. If Egypt fell, the Suez Canal fell. If the canal fell, the oil fields of the Middle East would be handed to Adolf Hitler, and the British Empire's main artery would be severed. It was, without exaggeration, the brink of the abyss.
History books, popular movies, and countless documentaries will tell you what happened next. They will tell you that a man wearing a black beret with 2 badges, General Bernard Montgomery, arrived in the desert, rallied a broken army, and defeated Rommel at the Battle of El Alamein, turning the tide of the Second World War. But history is written by the victors, and in this case, the victors were not just the allies over the Axis. The victors were the politicians and the self-promoters who crafted a narrative to save their own careers. The truth is entirely different. The man who actually stopped Erwin Rommel, the man who saved the 8th Army from total annihilation, the man who laid the exact blueprint for the victory at El Alamein, was not Bernard Montgomery. It was a tall, quiet, uncompromising soldier named Claude Auchinleck. He was the commander who won the war in the desert, only to be sacked, scapegoated, and systematically erased from the history he helped forge. To understand how a hero of this magnitude could be pushed into the shadows, you have to understand the rigid, class-obsessed world of the British military establishment, and how Claude Auchinleck never truly belonged to it. Born in 1884 to a struggling military family, Auchinleck did not have the vast wealth or aristocratic connections that smoothed the paths of so many British generals. His father was a colonel in the Royal Artillery who died when Claude was just 8 years old, leaving the family in precarious financial straits. To pursue a military career, Auchinleck had to rely on sheer merit. After graduating from the Royal Military College at Sandhurst, he could not afford the expensive lifestyle required to join a prestigious British cavalry or infantry regiment. Instead, he took the path of the working soldier. He joined the British Indian Army. This single decision would define his entire life, his character, and ultimately, his downfall. The British Indian Army was a world apart from the drawing rooms of London and the elite gentlemen's clubs of Whitehall. It was a frontier force, deeply practical, intensely professional, and fundamentally meritocratic. In India, Auchinleck learned his trade commanding men of diverse faiths, languages, and cultures. He learned Punjabi. He ate with his troops. He learned that a commander's primary duty was the welfare and logistics of his men, not the polishing of his own public image. To the Indian troops, he was a revered figure. To his peers, he was simply the Auch. But to the British High Command in London, Indian Army officers were often viewed with a subtle, lingering snobbery. They were considered capable colonials, perhaps, but lacking the strategic genius and political refinement of the true British elite. Auchinleck was a soldier's soldier, utterly devoid of political cunning. He did not know how to flatter politicians. He did not know how to manipulate the press. He believed, with fatal naivety, that doing his job with absolute integrity would be enough. When the Second World War broke out, Auchinleck's sheer competence could not be ignored. He distinguished himself during the doomed Allied campaign in Norway in 1940, standing out as one of the few commanders to extract tactical success from a strategic disaster. By early 1941, he had been appointed Commander-in-Chief in India.
But the true test of his life was waiting in the blistering sands of North Africa.
In the summer of 1941, Prime Minister Winston Churchill was a man desperate for a victory. The war was going poorly. Britain stood alone against Germany. The Soviet Union was absorbing massive blows, and America was not yet in the fight. Churchill needed good news, and he needed it in the only active theatre of war where British troops were engaging Germans. North Africa. The commander in the Middle East, General Archibald Wavell, was exhausted. He had been outmaneuvered by the newly arrived Erwin Rommel. Churchill, ruthless in his demands, sacked Wavell and swapped him with Auchinleck. The Auch was flown to Cairo and handed the most complex, politically sensitive, and logistically nightmarish command in the British Empire. The Middle East Command was not just Egypt. It stretched from the borders of India through Iraq, Iran, Syria, Palestine, and down to East Africa. Auchinleck was not merely fighting a desert war, he was defending an entire hemisphere against potential Axis incursions from the north, through the Caucasus, and from the west, through Libya. Almost immediately, the friction between Auchinleck and Churchill began. Churchill, a brilliant wartime leader, but a notoriously impatient armchair general, demanded an immediate offensive to crush Rommel. He bombarded Auchinleck with telegrams, demanding action. Auchinleck, looking at his battered, under-equipped army, refused. He knew that the desert was a tactician's paradise, but a logistician's hell. Sending tanks into the open desert without proper supply lines, adequate training, and sufficient armor was suicide against a master of mobile warfare like Rommel. Auchinleck held his ground. He demanded time to train his men, to integrate new American-supplied Stuart tanks, and to build a massive logistical tail. Churchill was furious, taking Auchinleck's pragmatic caution as a sign of timidity. It was the beginning of a toxic dynamic. Churchill wanted a general who would paint glorious pictures of imminent victory. Auchinleck only offered cold, hard military reality. Finally, in November 1941, Auchinleck launched Operation Crusader. It was a massive, chaotic, swirling armoured battle across the Libyan desert. The British Eighth Army, commanded directly by General Alan Cunningham, threw itself at Rommel's Africa Corps. For days, the battle hung in the balance in a fog of dust, smoke, and burning steel. At the height of the crisis, Cunningham lost his nerve. Seeing his tank reserves dwindling, he ordered a general retreat, fearing the complete destruction of the Eighth Army. This was the moment Claude Auchinleck showed his true steel. Flying directly into the war zone, he arrived at Cunningham's headquarters. Where Cunningham saw defeat, Auchinleck saw a tactical reality. Rommel was extending himself too far. His supply lines were snapping. The German tanks were running out of fuel and ammunition. Auchinleck immediately relieved Cunningham of his command, took personal control of the battle, and countermanded the retreat. He ordered the Eighth Army to stand fast and attack. He was right. Rommel, overextended and exhausted, was forced to retreat. Auchinleck pushed a desert fox all the way back to El Agheila, relieving the besieged garrison of Tobruk in the process. It was the first time in the Second World War that a British army had defeated a German army in a major campaign. By all rights, this should have cemented Auchinleck's reputation, but the victory was fleeting. In December 1941, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. The world exploded into global war. Churchill, desperate to save the Far East, stripped Auchinleck of his veteran divisions, his best aircraft, and his armor, shipping them to India and Burma. Meanwhile, Rommel received a massive influx of new tanks, fuel, and fresh troops from Europe. The balance of power shifted overnight. In May 1942, Rommel unleashed his masterpiece, the Battle of Gazala. Striking with terrifying speed, he outflanked the British lines. The Eighth Army was now commanded by General Neil Ritchie, a man thoroughly outmatched by the German commander. Ritchie's command structure collapsed. British armoured brigades were destroyed piecemeal. And then came the absolute catastrophe. In June 1942, the fortress of Tobruk, the symbol of British defiance, fell to Rommel in a single day. 33,000 Allied soldiers surrendered. Winston Churchill was sitting in the Oval Office with President Franklin D. Roosevelt when a telegram was handed to him containing the news. Churchill later wrote that it was one of the most bitter moments of his life. A British army had collapsed. A garrison had surrendered without a fight. The political humiliation was absolute, and Churchill faced a vote of no confidence back in the House of Commons. He needed a scapegoat, and he needed one fast. In the desert, the Eighth Army was disintegrating. Ritchie was ordering a retreat that was rapidly turning into a rout. The road to Alexandria was wide open. It was the darkest hour of the North African campaign. Once again, Claude Auchinleck stepped into the breach. On June 25, 1942, Auchinleck flew to the front, fired Ritchie, and took direct personal command of the shattered Eighth Army. What he found was an army paralyzed by the myth of Rommel. The troops were exhausted, confused, and terrified of the seemingly invincible desert fox. Auchinleck knew he could not stop Rommel in the open desert. He needed a geographical anchor. Looking at the map, he ordered the entire army to retreat to a little-known railway halt called Alamein. It was a masterstroke of defensive strategy. The Desert War, up to this point, had been characterized by sweeping flanking maneuvers, but Alamein was different. To the north lay the Mediterranean Sea. To the south, just 40 miles away, lay the Qattara Depression, a massive, impassable salt sink that no tank could cross. By anchoring his army between the sea and the depression, Auchinleck created a bottleneck. Rommel could not flank him. The Desert Fox would be forced to attack head-on into prepared British defences. As the panicked Eighth Army streamed into the Alamein line, Auchinleck stood like a rock in the rushing river. He issued an order that has gone down in military history for its brutal clarity, though the man who wrote it is rarely credited. He banned the word retreat. He ordered that all plans for falling back to the Nile Delta be burned. He told his men they would fight at Alamein, and if they could not hold, they would die there. On July 1st, 1942, Rommel threw the weight of his Africa Corps against the Alamein line. He expected the British to crumble, just as they had at Gazala. He expected to be in Alexandria in 3 days. Instead, he hit a wall of steel, artillery, and unyielding resistance. This was the first battle of Alamein. Over the next month, beneath a boiling summer sun, one of the most savage and strategically critical battles of the war took place. Rommel attacked again and again. Every time the Germans broke through, Auchinleck was there, shifting his reserves, identifying the weak point, and launching immediate, vicious counterattacks. Auchinleck possessed the tactical intuition that matched Rommel's, but he paired it with a ruthless understanding of logistics. He realized that the German army, sitting at the very end of a massive supply line stretching back to Tripoli, was running on fumes. He didn't just want to stop Rommel. He wanted to bleed him to death. Day after day, Auchinleck launched precise attacks against the weaker Italian divisions supporting Rommel, forcing the German panzers to rush desperately from one sector to another to plug the gaps. The Africa Corps was being ground into dust. The heat was apocalyptic. Men fought in swirling sandstorms, the metal of their tanks burning their skin. By the end of July, the first battle of Alamein was over. Rommel was entirely halted. His offensive had been broken. In his own private diary, the Desert Fox wrote a rare admission of defeat, noting that the British resistance had been too strong, their command too resolute. Claude Auchinleck had saved the Middle East. He had saved the Suez Canal. He had preserved the Eighth Army and halted the Axis advance in its tracks. It should have been his greatest triumph. Instead, it was the moment of his professional execution. In August 1942, Winston Churchill flew to Cairo. He was still smarting from the political disaster of Tobruk and the humiliation he suffered in front of the Americans. He wanted blood. He wanted a spectacular, aggressive victory to announce to the world. He met with Auchinleck and demanded that the 8th Army launch a massive offensive immediately to destroy Rommel once and for all. Auchinleck, as always, told the Prime Minister the unvarnished truth. The 8th Army was exhausted. It had taken terrible casualties stopping Rommel. To attack now, without building up overwhelming superiority in tanks and artillery, would be a disaster. Auchinleck stated firmly that he would not launch an offensive until mid-September, when his army was re-equipped and ready. Churchill was enraged. He viewed Auchinleck's careful, calculated approach as a failure of fighting spirit. The Prime Minister did not want a general who understood logistics. He wanted a general who understood theatre. He wanted someone who would project an aura of inevitable victory. On August 8, 1942, Claude Auchinleck received a handwritten letter from Winston Churchill. He was sacked. He was stripped of his command of the 8th Army and removed as Commander-in-Chief of the Middle East. It was a brutal, unceremonious end to the tenure of the man who had just saved the Allied cause in the theatre. In his place, Churchill brought in 2 men. General Harold Alexander took over the Middle East command, and a relatively unknown officer named Bernard Montgomery was given command of the 8th Army. What happened next is one of the most frustrating chapters in military history. Montgomery arrived in the desert like a whirlwind. He possessed exactly what Auchinleck lacked, an absolute mastery of public relations. Montgomery gathered the press, gathered the troops, and delivered fiery speeches. He told the men that there would be no more retreat. He told them he had ordered all plans for falling back to be burned. He claimed he was bringing a completely new ethos to the 8th Army. He was, of course, repeating almost verbatim the orders Auchinleck had already issued a month prior. Montgomery looked at the defensive positions Auchinleck had painstakingly laid out at El Alamein, the exact positions that had already stopped Rommel in July. Montgomery claimed them as his own. When Montgomery fought the Battle of Alam Halfa a few weeks later, defeating a desperate Axis attack, he fought it using the exact defensive strategy Auchinleck had drawn up before he was fired. And when Churchill demanded that Montgomery launch an immediate offensive, just as he had demanded of Auchinleck, Montgomery flatly refused. He told Churchill he would not attack until his army was fully supplied, vastly superior in numbers, and completely trained. He delayed the offensive until late October. Churchill, mesmerized by Montgomery's charisma and confidence, accepted the delay. He gave Montgomery the time, the tanks, and the troops that he had vehemently denied to Auchinleck. In November 1942, Montgomery launched the Second Battle of El Alamein. With an overwhelming numerical and material advantage, he finally shattered Rommel's army. The church bells rang in London. Churchill famously declared it the end of the beginning. Montgomery was elevated to the status of a national god, knighted and forever immortalized as the victor of the Desert War. And Claude Auchinleck? He was quietly pushed into the margins. Offered a lesser command in the Middle East as a consolation prize, Auchinleck's deep pride and sense of honor led him to refuse it. He returned to India, unemployed, and spent nearly a year in the wilderness. He watched from the sidelines as the men who had replaced him reaped the glory of the groundwork he had laid. The profound injustice of it would have broken a lesser man. Many generals would have gone to the press, leaked documents, or written scathing memoirs defending their reputation. But Auchinleck was not a politician. He was a soldier of the old school. He believed that engaging in a public mudslinging contest with the Prime Minister, while the nation was fighting for its survival, was deeply dishonorable. He remained entirely silent. Eventually, his undeniable competence was needed again. In 1943, he was reinstated as Commander-in-Chief of the Indian Army. It was a monumental task. While the world focused on the glamorous theatres of Europe, Auchinleck was tasked with turning India into the massive logistical base required to fight the Japanese in Burma. He oversaw the expansion, training, and supply of the largest volunteer army in human history. General William Slim, the brilliant commander of the 14th Army in Burma,
openly stated that his victories over the Japanese would have been utterly impossible without the tireless, unseen work of Claude Auchinleck in India.
Yet, even in this role, Auchinleck was destined for heartbreak. When the war ended, the British Empire began to dismantle itself. In 1947, India was granted independence, and the subcontinent was torn apart by the violent, bloody partition into India and Pakistan. For Auchinleck, this was a personal tragedy of incomprehensible scale. The Indian Army, the institution he had devoted his entire life to, an army where Muslims, Hindus, and Sikhs had fought and died together shoulder to shoulder for generations, was to be split in two.
As a supreme commander charged with overseeing the division of the armed forces, Auchinleck watched helplessly as the regiments he loved turned on each other amidst the sectarian slaughter of partition. He worked himself to exhaustion, trying to ensure a fair and peaceful division of assets, trying to protect the soldiers who were being caught in the political crossfire. He was hated by the new political leaders of both India and Pakistan, who accused him of favoritism. In late 1947, his position became untenable. The partition of the army was complete, and Claude Auchinleck, the last commander-in-chief of a unified Indian army, resigned. He was offered a peerage, a seat in the House of Lords, and a title, the traditional reward for a victorious British general. Men who had achieved far less had gladly accepted the honour. Auchinleck refused. He told the government that he could not accept an honour for overseeing the destruction of the army he loved. It was a final, quiet act of supreme integrity.
Claude Auchinleck retired and eventually moved to Marrakesh, Morocco. He lived a quiet, Spartan life. As the decades passed, the generals and politicians of the Second World War published their memoirs. Montgomery wrote books elevating his own genius. Churchill wrote a sweeping history of the war that conveniently smoothed over his own strategic blunders and justified his firing of commanders who disagreed with him. Auchinleck wrote nothing. He refused large sums of money from publishers who begged him for his side of the story. He maintained that a commander's duty was to serve, not to self-aggrandize. When he occasionally had visitors in his modest Moroccan home, military historians would press him on the events of 1942. They would ask him about the First Battle of El Alamein, about how it felt to be sacked just when he had won the defining battle of the campaign, and about Montgomery stealing his blueprints. Auchinleck would only smile gently, offer his guests a drink, and change the subject. He harbored no bitterness, or, if he did, he buried it under an iron sense of duty. He knew what he had done. He knew that when the Eighth Army was bleeding to death, he had stepped into the fire and saved it. He didn't need a politician's approval or a book deal to validate his reality. Claude Auchinleck died in 1981 at the age of 96. He passed away largely forgotten by the general public, overshadowed entirely by the myth of Montgomery and the towering figure of Churchill. But military history, when stripped of its political spin, reveals a stark truth. Without Bernard Montgomery, the Second Battle of El Alamein might have been fought slightly differently, but it would have been fought with overwhelming Allied superiority. Without Claude Auchinleck, in the desperate days of July 1942, there would have been no Eighth Army left to fight it. He was the architect of the victory in North Africa. He was a man who possessed the brilliance to stop the Desert Fox and the absolute integrity to refuse the political games of Westminster. He sacrificed his own place in the history books because he cared more about winning the war than winning the credit. Claude Auchinleck remains the general who won the war, saved an empire, and allowed himself to be erased from history simply because he believed a true soldier needed no applause.